very welcome and thank you for joining me. My guest today is Síofra O'Donovan, and Síofra is the grandniece of Kevin Barry. And you will, of course, know that Kevin Barry is the 18-year-old man who gave his life for Ireland in 1920. You're very welcome, Síofra.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah. Before we begin chatting about Kevin, maybe you might tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I came from a family that was on one side of my father's side, very steeped in republicanism, but nobody was actively Republican in my childhood growing up. But there was great interest and great pride in history and family history. I naturally became a writer. My father was, and I were so close. He was like a mentor to me. He was a journalist in the Irish Times, and prior to that, the Independent. And I later wrote, contributed quite a bit to the Irish Times, just cultural things, literary things. I don't write for them anymore. So I started writing really from when I left college. I started writing my first novel. I wrote a number of novels and had a few published. And this book, Yours Still Hell Freezes, is the first historical biography, probably the most frightening thing I ever had to write. But it felt like a duty that I had to do, a duty to my ancestors, to my father and my grandfather and my granduncle.
Okay, so let's begin then with Kevin Barry, and he was your granduncle. So maybe you might just tell us just about the lineage and how he is your granduncle.
Kevin was the brother of my grandmother Monty, who was christened Mary Christina Barry, and she was quite a few years younger than Kevin, so that when Kevin was very active in the IRA, she was really too young to really fully understand what was going on, but she was later fiercely proud of him. So Kevin, in the family, he was sort of like not a ghost, but definitely a presence. My father used to tell me a lot of stories about him. And when I was 11, my father turned around to me and said he'd written another book before. He was still a journalist, and he said, "What'll I write next?" And I said, "You write a biography of Kevin Barry." And so it was like this kind of bond between me, Dad, and Kevin Barry. It felt like that anyway. And so Dad went off and started doing his research for writing his biography of Kevin Barry, which was published in 1989 by Glendale Press. And so I never thought it would fall upon me to do that. I never thought I could. I never intended to, and I don't think I have outshone my father, but my father's work was absolutely wonderful. His research was really incredible. But Dad didn't have access to things that I have access to now. So Dad didn't have access to, for example, a lot of witness statements in the Bureau of Military History that hadn't been released yet. So, except he was allowed as a family member to see his own father's witness statement and Kevin Barry's older sister, Kitby, or Kathleen Barry, her witness statement, which was invaluable to me in writing this, and it was invaluable to my father.
Okay, so maybe you might just then tell us a little bit about Kevin's childhood, where he grew up. And I do know that he was a first-year medical student when he died. So just tell us a little bit about his background. And I know there is a connection with Carlow.
Yeah, well, the Barry family, Thomas Barry, his father's family, were from Tombay in Hackettstown, County Carlow. And they had a Conacre farm and with a lot of cattle. And he was a strong farmer, as they called them. And he had a lot of dairy cows. And he and his sister Judith Barry looked to Dublin to develop their business and expand. And so Judith Barry went up to Dublin and she bought a house on number 8 Fleet Street. I was actually in it yesterday, but it's obviously very different now. Number 8 Fleet Street. and they had a dairy shop below. And over in Pimlico, they had a dairy yard, and that was actually right beside James Connolly's house. So Kevin was born in Dublin, actually, in 1902 on the 20th of January. And he was the second son. Michael Barry was his older brother. But Michael Barry, well, in 1900, when Kevin was 6 years old, 1908, his father, Thomas Barry, died. And he said, he basically left a wish or in his will that the Dublin dairy yards be sold, that Fleet Street be sold. But the women of the family were becoming very strong, and already were very strong. And Judith Barry was formidable as well. So she said basically no to the solicitor. That's not happening. We're staying here. We're going to keep the business going. We can do that. And but then the family slightly divided. They sent the younger children down to back to Hackettstown, to Tom Bay, to the family home, where they were schooled and reared. And the rest of them, the older ones, stayed in Dublin. So Kevin and his brother Michael went to Rathvilly National School. And people might wonder why he didn't go to Hackettstown National School. But Rathvilly had a schoolmaster who was known throughout Ireland as a wonderful kind of pedagogue. And he, I've just forgotten his name, but I'll find it in here in a sec. He was very, very fond of Kevin, and made an attempt when Kevin was on death row, basically, to have a local MP ask Lloyd George for a reprieve, but it failed, of course. I just can't remember his name.
That doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So then moving on then to his secondary education, tell me about that, and about how he ended up then as a medical student.
Well, when he was around 13, he went back to Dublin, and he was sent to the O'Connell schools for about a year. And that was where he met Frank Flood, who was a very dear friend. And he later was in the H Company in the IRA with Frank Flood. But anyway, Kevin only went there. I think the school closed down or something after a year. And then Kitby, his elder sister, had become the kind of manager of the family. And she wanted Kevin to go to the best school in Dublin. So she made sure that he went to Belvedere College, and his mother did obviously as well. But Kitby had a particular interest in Kevin, and it was almost like she lived through him vicariously or something, because she also knew, they both knew, by the time Kevin was 13 years old, they had gone together to a commemoration for the Manchester martyrs who had been hanged in Manchester in 1868, I think. And at that commemoration, both of them realized that they were going to become committed Republicans. Kevin wanted to join the young Fenians there and then. His mother said no, but he did join in secret. He joined the IRA volunteers, the Dublin Brigade C Company in 1915 or 17. So he was 15 when he actually joined, but he was in Belvedere.
Okay, so then he moved on then to UCD and became a medical student.
Yes, he got a scholarship to go to UCD to study medicine, and his very best friend in Belvedere, Jerry McAleer, also went to study medicine in UCD. And there were a number of really interesting students at the time who were many of whom were secretly involved in the IRA, such as Todd Andrews, who's Ryan Tubridy's grandfather, my own grandfather, Jim O'Donovan, Frank Flood. I think Frank Flood was doing engineering, but there was a lot of them. And they would not be acknowledging each other on the campus as members. Obviously, they had to take an oath. So Kevin,
okay.
Yeah.
So I know that you have done quite an amount of research for your book. So have you learned anything about the type of activity that he got up to then, around 2000 and, it would be, sorry, 1919, it would have been around 1919 and into 1920?
Yeah, well, before that he'd been doing, let's say, a lot of what you call mobilization orders and things like that. But coming into 1920, this was when he really kind of, let's say, matured as a young soldier. So the most significant military exploit that he got involved with, and it all coincided with his first year in college. So on 1st of June 1920, the H Company, Captain Seamus Kavanagh and others planned a raid on the King's Inns on the 1st of June 1920. And they planned it meticulously. They planned it so that nobody would be hurt. They simply wanted to get the arms that they needed. Now, the King's Inns, you have to remember, was the centre of the military nerve point for the British. So it was risky. But they planned it very, very well. It depended on good weather. The girlfriends of some of the soldiers were out, the British soldiers were outside on the grass, and it all worked very much to their advantage. And it all happened within about 7 minutes. Within 7 minutes, they had, you know, various soldiers muffled or under control anyway. And Kevin had gone into the guard room and had taken a Lewis gun. And this was like a little rite of passage, really, because Dinny Holmes, in his account of this raid, describes Kevin coming out of the guard room with a Lewis gun, grinning ear to ear, and saying to Dinny Holmes, "Look what I got," delighted with himself. And Dinny Holmes said that it was like a child with a toy. And yet he could see that Kevin's decisions and movements within that raid were very meticulous and significant and helped everything run very smoothly. So after that, Captain Seamus Kavanagh had him marked for the next military enterprise or exploit, which the most significant one in Dublin. The next one would be the one which would lead him to his death on the 20th of September 1920. On the famous ambush on the Monk's Bakery on Church Street in Dublin. However, you have to remember that every summer Kevin would go home to Carlow and he would be helping his brother Michael a bit on the farm. But more significantly, that summer, Michael Barry was already involved in local IRA activities around Carlow, and Kevin's sister Shell was in the C Company. His brother was in the C Company down there, and Kevin joined in with that. On various different raids while he was down there, and his sister Shell was very active in Kavanagh. Now Kitby, his eldest sister, she was in Dublin managing all the family affairs. I think she would have loved to at that time have been involved with Kavanagh, but she had too many family commitments and couldn't. But Kevin, one of the famous raids that summer down in Carlow was the raid, it was actually Wicklow, Kavanagh Barracks, which still stands. But there was a plan. They were sent orders by the Active Service Unit this was Mick MacDonald and his half brother Tom. They were given orders to burn down Kavanagh Barracks because John Redmond's son was occupying it as a hunting lodge with his wife. I think her name was Diana. And so they were to burn this down. Anyway, there's a great story about this. Kevin gets in the back window. They all cycle up. This is Matt Cullen, who gave an account to my grandfather directly of the raid that had happened. Kevin Barry, Michael Barry, and various others. And they all arrive up with the intention of burning the barracks down. Kevin goes in the back window. John Redmond has some kind of a club in his hand. The description is quite comical. Apparently, a hysterical woman came out and read Kevin the Riot Act. And then they all backed down and said, all right. And they made some kind of deal. If you don't, let the redcoats in here to use the barracks, well, we'll let you off. We won't burn the place down. But a local man in Wicklow, who lived very close to there, told me a story that his father had told him, who had heard about it just after it happened, that the woman was the housekeeper and she had, quite intimidated the lads and said, how dare you? What do you think you're doing? And put a stop to the raid on Kavanagh Barracks, or the burning of it anyway.
Okay, so we move on now to September 1920 and the raid on the bakery. And as you say, this was ultimately to lead to his death at the tender age of 18. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Kevin had failed his summer exams. As you can imagine, he was very distracted. Not only, I'm just talking about back in June. I have to go back a little bit just to give a bit of background. So Kevin had failed his first year medical exams. And the captain of the H Company, Seamus Kavanagh, was concerned that Kevin shouldn't get too distracted from his academic life. And so he very much dissuaded Kevin from being involved in this raid that was planned meticulously. They'd done quite a lot of reconnaissance in the area, because there was going to be a lorry load of soldiers arrived every morning, and they wanted to get their arms. Basically, they did the bread run to the Monk's Bakery. So it was all planned very meticulously, but it did go wrong because of timing. But anyway, Kevin had said he very much wanted to be part of this, and Captain Seamus Kavanagh said, "No, you need to do your resits there that day at 2 o'clock." And Kevin said, "No, I really need to do this. This is really, it's so important for me to do this." And so Captain Kavanagh, I found all this out in Captain Seamus Kavanagh's witness statement. So yes, he described in detail how he then got his contact in UCD. Captain Kavanagh talked to Kevin's professor and said, "Just do him a favor, okay? He needs to do this." So you can imagine the kind of rapport. So Kevin then was delighted and beamed all over when Captain Kavanagh said, "Right, you're on. Okay, be here at 8 o'clock in the morning." So before Kevin didn't stay on 8 Fleet Street that night. He stayed in his cousin Pat Dowling's on South Circular Road instead, because it was safer for the family. He knew this was very risky. He knew this was a big deal. This was bigger than the King's Inns raid, but they expected that it would go as well because that had gone so smoothly. So Kevin stayed in Pat Dowling's, and on the way to meet everybody, I think it was up in Parnell Square, he quickly went to Mass on Clarendon Street, which is where the Barrys went to Mass. And because he'd done that, he was a little bit late. He was about 5-10 minutes late. And that was not, Captain Kavanagh was not impressed with this. As a result of that, Kevin was given the dregs of the arms, which was they all needed to have a revolver of some sort. And Kevin was given a .38 Mauser Parabellum, and it was renowned for jamming. And this was almost like, you can see how his fate was sealed if you look back and you track back, because when the soldiers in the lorry, the British soldiers, were late arriving on the scene, and so there was a bit of somebody got a bit of a fright in the company and made a shot, and then it was chaos. So Kevin made a shot, then dived under the lorry. Why? Because his revolver jammed. Okay, and then you can imagine there was a great furore and a lot of chaos. Was a shootout between the British soldiers and the IRA lads. And in the meantime, they scarpered, but a whistle had never been blown to give them the warning that they should all scarper. But they had scarpered, and Kevin suddenly realised he was under the lorry and he was on his own. And a woman called Mrs. Garrett, we discovered later, who owned a coal and vegetable shop, saw Kevin under the lorry and said, "There's a man under the lorry." Now, did she mean to rat on him? Kevin Barry himself didn't think so, but that was how he was caught. He could have escaped, probably could have escaped otherwise. So he was then taken, not to the North Dublin Union, but to Bridewell Prison and interrogated. This is where the famous interrogation happened, which was then published in the papers before the execution. Didn't do a bit of good to sway.
Can I just hold you there to clarify a couple of things?
Yes.
Now, the reason why there was a raid on the bakery, I believe, because I've just had some time to read over your book. The reason why this was all centred on the bakery was because they had carried out surveillance prior to, and they knew that a contingent of British soldiers used to come to this bakery to get a supply of bread at more or less the same time each day. They knew that this was the spot where where it was going to be easy to ambush them. So just to clarify that detail.
Yeah. That's exactly.
So the other thing is that some British soldiers were killed in the shootout. So just tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, and Captain Private Washington was shot. Private, I think, Whitehead as well, and I think Captain Barth, I can't remember the name of the third one. Two of them were injured at the time, but one of them was shot and died instantly, and I think that was Private Washington. And Kevin was guilty by association, even if he hadn't directly shot that soldier, but they did claim to have evidence, but the evidence was a little bit dubious. However, it does seem to be the case that he did shoot Private Washington, because in Kitby, his sister's witness statement, she described how she went out to meet Kevin and to talk to him for the first time since the arrest out the back of Marlborough Barracks at the court-martial on the 20th of October 1920. And he described everything to her in great detail. And he said, "I shot a soldier." Now, Kitby withheld that information, even from my grandfather when he was researching his own book.
Right.
So that's very interesting. And my father goes into that in his own book. But he couldn't state in his own book where he got that information, because at the time the witness statements were not, that witness statement of his aunt Kitby wasn't in the public domain, but I was able to say it in my own book. So that piece of information is very important, obviously. So,
right.
So Kevin was tried for murder and hanged for murder. So
there was an outcry ahead of his execution. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, a lot of people rallied to help. Notably, Michael Collins had planned an escape plan that didn't work. The IRA company which Kevin was a member of, also planned an escape. But the family kept saying, "Don't waste any more men. If this goes wrong, we could lose so many." And Kevin himself didn't really want any part of that. There was a very elaborate escape plan in which Kitby and her sister Elgin, so Kevin's two sisters, were to go in. And the timing again went wrong because they had a slot, and they had a visitation slot. And just ahead of them went in a priest from County Carlow. So he got priority. And because the timing was off, they knew that now Kevin wasn't aware of the escape plan. When they got to the room, they were so, well, at least Elgin, who was a little bit younger, was so overwhelmed she could hardly speak to Kevin. And the guards were all in the room. And as they went in through Mountjoy, there were auxiliaries everywhere. And it was a stronger presence of auxiliaries now, because they knew it was very tense. There was a lot of publicity. There was a lot of press. There was a lot of people trying to help. There was Kevin's schoolmaster in Carlow who had contacted a local MP who had gone to Lloyd George, who Lloyd George was known for turning on his tears. He cried. He said he would try. He didn't do anything. He went off for the weekend. And then the same MP decided he would try King George, who'd also gone off for the weekend somewhere. There wasn't going to be a reprieve. And if you look back at manuscript 8043, which was the civilian file on Kevin Barry, which was kept at Dublin Castle, that was actually stolen by my grandfather, Jim O'Donovan, in 1921. So he kept this for many years and then gave it to the National Library. And that was an invaluable resource for me and for my father when we were writing our books. But in that you can see General Macready was given the description over the phone of what happened at the Monk's Bakery by Colonel Topping, like every detail. And he just writes back one note. He says, "Try for murder." So it was as if it was already decided. That was long before, well, a month before the court martial. But it was, that was the attitude. We're going to hang this boy.
Okay.
Bakery boy, they called him.
Right. Well, I have to say it is a very, very interesting story. I just like to pitch up now. I suppose, it's difficult to say this, but I think it's something that perhaps needs to be said in commemorating not just Kevin Barry, but other people that took part in the War of Independence and indeed in the 1916 Rising. Is there a danger that it might inspire young people today to do likewise, to, take up arms as a means to an end?
I think the generation is so different. I don't see that being in any way a danger. I think that if you allow our young people through the educational system and perhaps in the media as well, to understand why these young men did what they did, to put it into context, to help them to understand, it might give them some sense of pride, some sense of understanding of how it came to be that we have a democratic republic. It doesn't necessarily, I know that Kevin Barry has become the icon of, say, Sinn Féin or the IRA or whatever, but I think we need to divorce it from that. Divorce him, not necessarily just divorce. Everybody has a right to honor the heroes they want to honor, and God only knows why Kevin Barry became so famous. It's probably because of the song, that became so well known. It was recorded by Paul Robeson in the 50s. But to honor young people who gave their lives for the foundation of a democratic republic, I don't see what on earth can be wrong with that. In India, they honor their heroes. In other countries that have been colonized, they honor their heroes. Why is it here that to do so, you're then branded as some right-wing lunatic? I just can't understand it. There's no pride at all. And if you show any pride, you're then branded as a right-wing lunatic or a member of the IRA or somebody who condones violence. The violence I feel it had a context. Nothing that anybody would have done in any company of the IRA was not, they were absolutely, they had to be completely 100% accountable to Dáil Éireann, which was a fully legitimate political body, a parliament. So you have to look at it in that context. You can't just, because of what happened in the north, because of renegade terrorism, you cannot lump it in with that. You've got to separate it. You've got to look at the mentality of the time. You've got to look at the previous struggles. You've got to look at the tragedy of the Irish attempts to become free of the British from, let's say, 1798 on. Of course, it was before that, but let's say 1798 is very significant. If we don't, then what do we have? I don't know. I don't understand what this country is anymore. I don't even think we have a republic anymore.
Well, yes, and I suppose just finally, I'd just like to put the question to you. Maybe you might briefly give me an answer. Looking at what is actually happening at the moment in our country in 2021, do you feel that these men who gave their lives for Ireland was in some way in vain?
I'm afraid I do at this point, yes. I think I never thought I'd see a day where it's so obvious to me, as I see it from my perspective, that the constitution of this country has been trampled upon. Our rights as citizens have been, as far as I'm concerned, violated. We have very little true civil freedoms. I never thought that it could come to this, and I was looking at it all the way through 2020, a year that I'd been looking forward to bring my book out to commemorate Kevin Barry. It couldn't have been more different. Can you imagine, lockdown after lockdown? And I look back and I see it in context of what Kevin Barry and his generation lived through. A real pandemic. 50 million people died in the Spanish influenza. 100 million infected. What was the world population? 1.5 billion. And now, I don't know how many have died of COVID. Is it 8 million now? I don't know. What's the world population? 8 billion. When you just put things into context, they also had the Easter Rising. They also had an utterly devastating world war. They lived through that. And yet they still could go dancing. They could still go to the pub. They still lived. we're being asked not to live our lives. That is completely morally, ethically, economically, spiritually wrong, as far as I'm concerned anyway. I have very strong views on it though.
Okay, so on that note then we shall end it. I want to thank you so much, Síofra, for taking time out to chat to me today. And if I just hold up your book, this is it. It's Yours Till Hell Freezes, and I just read a little piece from the inside cover. It says, this book brings new life to Kevin Barry using material from family papers and the public domain. The poignant description of his final hours is gripping and chilling in its detail. So I'm sure it's available in all good bookshops. And as I say, I've just had a chance to have a read, and it really is a gripping read. So thank you so much, Síofra. And to you who have joined us in this conversation, I would like to thank you. Compass Media, new community media platform, and we are depending on your support in order for our platform to grow. So please like and share this video and subscribe to our Facebook page. Thank you so much for watching, and until the next time, Bannocht de Arif Galer.